If you find you're unsettled listening today, reach out to a trusted friend or go to tradespodcast.com and click on resources.
We are men in the trades, forging health in the drug poisoning crisis. This is
Off the Clock Toolbox Talk.
Hi, Karen here. Daniel was meant to be the main host on this episode, but he got called away to an urgent priority right before we got started. So this episode for Men in the Trades by Men in the Trades is mostly two chicks talking. Fortunately, a member of our steering committee, Stephen, joined the call from his work site as he could. Our guest today is Lianne Radmore, speaking from over 20 years of experience working in Fraser Health substance use services and public health. Lianne was very much herself in the original conversation, but called me a few days after the recording to say that we had to redact some of her common language so she can maintain her professional reputation. At the same time, the primary piece of feedback we have received from our listeners is that we have to swear more if tradespeople are going to take us fucking seriously. So this episode is a weird combo of redacted and unredacted language. Welcome to our slightly awkward and totally authentic episode on using safely. Lianne, do you need to say a little piece about kind of who you are, what you do, and that you're not speaking for Fraser Health?
I absolutely need to say that I am not. Anything that I share today is my own personal opinion. And while I hold a position with Fraser Health as the harm reduction coordinator for the East, everything that I talk about today does not necessarily reflect the views of Fraser Health.
Using safely. When I said, hey, Lianne, can you come and talk about an episode about how to use safely? What did you say to me?
I said, no. I said no, because I don't want to be on a podcast because I'm anxious about it. And then Karen talked to me about all the reasons why it would make sense that I come and speak. And I think that the first thing I said was, I think we have to be really cautious about saying using safely in this time and in the current circumstances in the toxic drug supply. We can talk about using safer. We can't, there's no, until we have safe supply that is regulated in the same way that we have alcohol and cannabis regulated. That is the only way that we'll ever be able to talk about safe use. But for now, based on the current circumstances in our world, we have to talk about how to use safer, and really talk about how folks' relationships with substances is different for every individual. I think that those are the things I said. Yes,
that is what you said. And it was that key piece of we do want to talk about using safely, but we also want to talk about the fact that there is no way to use 100% safely right now. So, Lianne, what are some of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about using safer?
I think that you can plan for using safer. And this is really with the understanding that people are being thoughtful about their substance use. And I think we make assumptions about folks and their and how they use substances, that they're not thoughtful about how they use substances. And my experience over the last few years has really shown me that people are very thoughtful about how they're using substances and where they're using substances and in what setting they're using substances. And I think it's really important that people think about it in kind of chunks. Like if I want to use safer, if I want to use in a more safe way, I want to make sure that I have safe equipment. So I want to have sterile equipment. So I want to be able to access supplies that prevent the transmission of bloodborne illnesses. But I also want to think about my own mindset around what are the reasons why I'm using right now, and where am I using right now, and who am I using with, or am I using by myself? And so it goes beyond just having safer equipment or more sterile equipment. It's also about, is the person I'm going to use with, or are we going to ride the rails till 4:00 in the morning and shit's going to go sideways, or am I going to, in the same way that I think about my own substance use, like maybe I go for a drink with Karen and we have a couple of drinks and it's fine, but I certainly have friends that I might ride the rails with, and we might go out and it's late and we end up in situations that maybe I wouldn't have ended up in with a different human being. And so I think about, just for my own personal substance use, I think about who am I with, and and what are the reasons why I'm using, and when people start to deconstruct their reasons for using substances in the moment or over a period of time. Am I using right now because I'm super, super stressed out and really shitty things happened today and my boss was a and I have all of these things in my head, and so maybe that's the day I use too much. But if I'm thoughtful about that and I can recognize what's going on inside, I can be like, oh, actually, I know what's happening here. And maybe today I'm just going to have 3 drinks instead of 10 drinks or whatever it is. And I think folks don't think about their relationships with substances in that. I mean, we all use substances, and quite frankly, I have more in common with people who use substances than people who don't. Like, I mean, I don't have a lot in common with people who say, and I have the utmost respect for them and wish I could be those folks. But the folks who say, oh, my body is a temple and I never put anything inside my body, I think, right on, man. I super wish that I was that strong. But I'm telling you, if I got a headache, or if I do have a stressful day, there's a good chance that I might take some Tylenol, and there's a good chance that I might have a drink if I'm feeling stressed out. Like, and I don't think that I'm a rare human being. I think that I think that's probably a common reaction for folks. And so I just think that when we start to look at our relationships with substances, we spend a lot of time trying to get people to not use substances instead of really looking at, well, what is it for?
Yeah.
Because substances in themselves are they're not evil or bad, or right. A drug is a drug is a drug. There's nothing evil or bad or about it. It's really about the life circumstances in which you're using those substances.
Absolutely.
And so when you think about that, the idea of using safer actually can start to you can start to think about, oh, I've never really thought about, like, I just automatically go and do these things, but just because it's automatic doesn't mean that it's a good fit for you. So how do we start to deconstruct really our relationships with substances and what that looks like? And in turn, when we do that, we can start to use in more safe manners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was laughing, it was knowing laughter when you were talking about, like, oh, like, some people say my body is a temple and I don't want to put anything in it, but I would connect that to some degree with privilege, because just the things that I have going on in my life, I'm like, there are days when it's not compassionate, it's cruel for me not to use something like, say, Tylenol or something like that, because I can't function in that level of suffering from the kind of pain that I'm in, whether it's psychological pain or physical pain. So it's actually the more humane thing to do some days for me to put substances into my body. Now, then that just gets back to the idea of the safe supply. I know when I go to the store and buy a bottle of Tylenol, there is actually Tylenol or acetaminophen in there. I'm not worried that there's, it's going to be double the dose that it says it is, or, I'm going to get, like with Tylenol, I'd be probably concerned maybe about liver damage at high levels of it, but I don't have to be worried about that because it says how much it is. I know what it is, but we don't know that about street supply. And that's what makes it so dangerous.
I do have one thing to mention. I guess it comes down to, like, so safe supplies, like where I work, I don't believe it's really out there to tell these people that we have it and it's a safe place. Like, there's certain places where you can come and use, but there's other places where you have to be staying. So I believe we need more, I think, safe injection places.
Yeah. And I would even say, like, there's more information that came out this week that was saying that Dr. Bonnie Henry was talking about it, about how it's actually a relatively lower percentage of drug poisoning that's happening in the downtown east side or on the streets, that the majority of it is actually happening in homes and in people's private residences and whatnot. So if we're talking about, say, safe injection sites and or safe smoking places, then I think we just need a lot more of them. They need to be just much more available in many more communities than they are right now. Because there's just a handful of them right now, if I'm correct. I don't know, Lianne, do you know anything about that?
I know a fair amount about the overdose prevention services that exist in the Fraser Health region, but I think what we also need to talk about is that, yes, there's absolutely a need for more services, more diverse services within communities, but to also think about how people see themselves in those services. So, for example, if I was to identify as someone who had a substance use disorder, or even as someone who used substances, if I used illicit substances, so if I was to identify myself as that, as me, as like Lianne Radmore, who works for the Fraser Health Authority, who is, I have lots of education, I have a reputation in communities, I people know me, et cetera, I wouldn't actually see myself in the services that are currently offered. Mm-hmm. Because I don't necessarily identify as having a substance use disorder. And it doesn't actually matter if I do or I don't. Doesn't matter if I have a substance use disorder or if I have a relationship with substances. None of that actually matters if I don't see myself in those services. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to think about the diversity of services and what needs to be available for folks. And it's a both and. So we need services for folks who would actively use an overdose prevention service, who would come to an inhalation space or an injection space. But we also actively need to be providing services for folks who, for virtue of just who they are or where they're from or how they see themselves, wouldn't engage in the services that currently exist. And so I do think that there's space for all of it. But I think that we need to really talk about the reasons why people won't identify as using substances, regardless of how I identify myself in that relationship with substances. I mean, we already know that most people who use substances actually don't have a substance use disorder, wouldn't even meet the criteria for a mild substance use disorder. We're talking about folks who may use regularly and still not identify as having a substance use disorder. We're also talking about folks who might use occasionally or daily. It doesn't actually matter how or how much people use. It's about how they see themselves in that relationship with their use. So, for example, I've talked a couple times about how I might have a drink or I might have a drink on the weekends, or today for sure I'm going out for drinks. Like I have a date, I'm going out, I'm going to have drinks. But when we talk about people and substance use, we often talk about people needing help. And there's no question that there are folks who require help for their substance use. At the same time, we also know that about 85 to 90% of the people who use substances don't actually develop a problematic relationship with substances. We actually need to talk about those folks too. Yeah. And we need to talk about how, for me, and I can openly identify that I have a relationship with substances. I don't see it as problematic. There's no one in my life who would see it as problematic. And when I see ads for things like AA or get help for your alcohol, I don't pay attention to those ads. Mm-hmm. Why would I? They don't mean anything to me. I don't identify as having an issue. So I don't pay attention. And that's not going to be any different than people who use substances that are illicit or deemed as illegal, but who still are doing the things. They are going to work. They are using in ways that are non-problematic. And we have a lot of mythology out there that can't be possible. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about that, when we're really talking about like using safer, we also need to talk about the stigma that comes along with talking about your substance use. So if I openly identify as having a relationship with alcohol, there's probably 100 people listening to this call who go, yeah, well, I have a drink on the weekends and I just got a new bottle of wine and I'm going to crack that on Saturday night with my husband. Like there might be all kinds of, but if I said, you know what, I just got myself a gram of Coke and I'm going to go out and I'm going to go out dancing with my friends. And sometimes when we go out dancing, we do a couple rails of coke because we think we're better dancers when we do that.
Yeah.
And I'm not identifying as having a problem with that particular substance. But the instant I say that, there's a thought that comes into people's heads. And I know this thought, oh, she must be in denial. There's some sort of problem here. If she's using that particular substance, and she probably needs help, even if she doesn't even recognize it. And so I've not once I indicated that I have an issue with a particular substance. But this is where the human brain goes. And so if we don't spend any time unpacking those kinds of things, it will continue to be unsafe for people who are actively using substances, regardless of how they're using those substances. It'll be really difficult for people to come forward and say, actually, yeah, I actually do use substances. I don't feel like I have a problem, but I sure would like an naloxone kit so I don't die.
Yes.
Or I sure would like to be able to use a sterile pipe instead of some wonky shit that I made at home because I'm feeling stigmatized and discriminated against to even go into a service to access the stuff that I personally, as Lianne, believe is a human right. If people choose to use substances for whatever reason, that's their deal. And I'm not against saying that there are not folks on this planet who do require significant levels of intervention and help as a result of an identified substance use disorder. There's no doubt that folks require support and help around that. At the same time, we also need to really talk about folks who don't identify in that same way and who we are actually seeing dying.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we prevent that from happening? What are some of the things that we can do if we're planning to go out and I don't even think, like, for a lot of people, it's not necessarily, you may not even be planning to go do coke when you're going out dancing. You just go out and you have a couple of drinks and then there's some coke available. And because you've had a couple of drinks, you're just engaging in it and you're just going with it.
Like, I think about, for every guy that's listening to this podcast, and you're going out on a Friday night. And I mean, I used to hang out with people who worked in trades on a regular basis. I remember my first love of my life worked in trades. So I spent a lot of time Friday and Saturday night in the bars, hanging out, watching the men drink, me drinking too, and thinking about the things that occurred, right? And thinking about like, and when you talked about like alcohol and, sometimes you have no plans of going out and using drugs, but you end up using drugs because you had a couple drinks. But to take that even further, I mean, alcohol is a depressant, but alcohol is a depressant, not that it makes you sad. Alcohol is a depressant in that it depresses your central nervous system, but it also depresses the voice inside your head that says, this is like a really great idea. Or this isn't a really great idea. So it stops that voice from actually working. So the voice that says to me after 5 drinks, it's not a good idea to dance naked on the table, or it's not a good idea to get into my car and drive and pick up my kid, that voice gets depressed. So really, like, alcohol stops your stopper from working. And so when you think about that, so you think about, okay, so if I am going out tonight, well, what do I need first? Well, usually what ends up happening when I'm out with the guys is you get fucking loaded and then I make a really dumb decision. All right. So what happens when I make that dumb decision? Okay. So what are those dumb decisions? Does that dumb decision mean that I might use a substance that I wouldn't normally use because I've had a few drinks? Well, if that's the case, and that's something that you're still wanting to do because it for whatever reason it fits for you, that's cool. Do you have an naloxone kit? Do all of the people that you know that are going out, are they trained in overdose response? Do we have, like, are people, do you have friends who are saying to you, dude, too much, you need to slow down? Do you have friends that are saying, you know what, sometimes you're a dick when you're drunk?
Yeah.
You might want to not drink so much. Like, these are the things that when we talk about using in a safer way, it's again about like what, it's the same as like I'm a woman and going into a bar, like safe. If I want to drink, I'm going to make sure that I don't leave my drink sitting on the table. Like that's a good, safe thing for me to do. I'm not saying I'm not going to drink. I'm not saying I'm not going to get drunk, but I'm definitely going to have people who got my back. I'm not going to be alone. I'm not walking into the bush with somebody because right. Like these are the things that we have to think about. It's almost like people may not plan their substance use, but the more you plan your substance use, the actual safer you are around how you do that.
Mm-hmm.
If you start to think about like, oh, when I go out on Friday night and Charlie's there, Charlie and I get into a lot of shit.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't get into shit with anybody else, but me and Charlie, shit goes sideways on a fairly regular basis. Okay. Well, you know what? Maybe me and Charlie need to have a conversation about how shit is going sideways and what kinds of things can we do to help each other to not go sideways. And again, this isn't about don't drink or don't drug. This is really about, have you been thoughtful about your substance use? Because oftentimes I think just as human beings, we just automatically go to, I feel shitty, I'm going to drink. I feel happy, I'm going to go party. And I feel like we connect substances to all kinds of emotions in our lives, and we do it for celebration. And none of that is wrong. But it's really about how do you deconstruct this so that it makes sense and so that you aren't dying. And then I think about like, do you have anyone in your life who can actually have a conversation about substances that isn't a shameful conversation or I'm disappointed in you conversation? Do you have someone in your life who you can act like, do you have a person who you can actively have conversations with about your substance use that you will still feel okay at the end of that, regardless of what you decide about how you are going to use your substances?
How do you find that person?
Well, I mean, I think it's really tough because I don't think that we have these conversations on a regular basis.
Exactly. That's not part of our normal interactions with people to have just in another episode, we were talking about just engaging with authenticity with whoever that you're with and being able to talk like what's really going on inside. And so many of us haven't had the opportunity to develop that. Some people call it self-awareness. Some people call it self-attunement, to understand even what it is that we're feeling inside and that we need to approach someone to talk about it. So there's like a whole bunch of micro steps in there too, as we move toward looking to find somebody that we can connect with. I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking there might be somebody, a friend, some coworker or something like that you might know, like, that dude's deep. He like thinks and talks about deep shit all the time. I know I can go talk to him about it. Or you might need to maybe look for a counselor or your employee assistance program or something like that. But if you're doing that, then you need to take the time and be aware that you may not connect with everybody right off the bat. And just because you don't connect with them doesn't mean that doesn't work and that it's fucked up to try to talk to anybody about that. Sometimes you have to go through a couple of people before you find your right person that you feel like you can connect with and talk to.
My question is, there's a lot of drinking and driving and there's a lot of other kind of deaths out there, but we kind of shied away from all that. It was more focused on the fentanyl. That would be my last little topic to bring up with you guys.
So when we talk about harm reduction, we're talking about all substances. Yeah, and harm reduction is just it is really like when you just boil it down, it is about how do we reduce the harms. We think about I think about my relationship with alcohol in my 20s versus my relationship as a teenager, where I really should be dead, right? Mm-hmm. And as it changed and shifted as a young adult, and as it changed and shifted as a woman in my 50s, who like now, I mean, and this is funny, like my dad was actually talking to me the other day and he said, I went out to the brewery on Friday night, I had 4 drinks. And my dad is like, I think he's in his I don't know. We don't talk about age in our family. So he said, he goes, I had 4 drinks. He said, this is all I had. He says, and the next day I was so hungover. My dad didn't expect that. He's like, I mean, my dad has had a fair few drinks in his lifetime. Like, he never expected that. So he was like, oh, this is change. So I now have to think about this, about how this like impacted me the whole day. The next day, he said he felt like shit.
Because you can't drink the same in maybe your 70s as you did in your 30s.
Or the time, or what you're drinking, you have to shift. Like for me, I can't drink, well, and that's a long story, but I can't drink whiskey. I never drink whiskey again as long as I live, right? Never, my whole life. But like I like vodka. I know that I can drink vodka. It doesn't hurt my stomach. I don't feel ill from it. Like, so these are like just alone that those are things to think about. Like, and we do this automatically without thinking. When you start to think about it, really, you start to recognize your own harm reduction practices that you're already doing and what you can actually start to improve on and how you can make those changes. So for every guy who's listening to this podcast, who's going to go out after work tonight or the next night or the next night, or sit at the site and tailgate and have some drinks, I really encourage people to start to think about their relationship with substances and what does it mean and what does it do for them, and where are the harms, if there are any harms, and if there are harms, are there anything that you can do to reduce those things? I guarantee you're already doing them. The other things around like using safe, like real practical things, other than thinking about like who are you with and where are you going and what are you choosing to put in your body today, et cetera, et cetera. It's also things like if you are using from the toxic drug supply, right? So, I mean, we've talked about alcohol today, but we also talk about the toxic drug supply. If you're using, there's a number of apps that folks can access. So there's the Lifeguard app. There's also the National Overdose Response Service line where people can call in and their use can be witnessed over the phone. And then there's also the Brave app, which is another sort of virtual witness to overdose app that folks can use. The Lifeguard app is actually connected to emergency services. So if folks are using by themselves and they happen to overdose, it's connected to emergency services. So ambulance does show up. The other two is not connected to emergency services, but you would be working or you would be talking to someone who would phone 911 on your behalf should your safety plan not, sort of work out in the way that you wanted it to work out. One of the things that's coming is an online marketplace for people to access harm reduction supplies online because I really recognize that lots of folks don't see themselves in the services that we offer for a variety of reasons. This is a new service that's coming online where folks who want to protect their confidentiality and their privacy will be able to access the online marketplace to access things like our fentanyl screening strips and our other sterile supplies and also naloxone kits. We also offer drug checking with FTIR technology. And I strongly encourage people, if you're accessing the toxic drug supply, come and get your drugs checked. Just get them checked. You'll find out what's in them. You'll have a conversation with people who know this work and who are, people who may have active relationships with substances themselves and are really just there to support and provide you with information about your substances. So I think that those are some really key things for people to do.
And where would you find the information about where your nearest place is where you could find safe supplies or get your drugs checked?
So you can go to the Fraser Health website and just Google drug checking, and that will give you a series of places where drug checking is available. You can also, for Fraser East, check and just Google Mountainside Harm Reduction Society and go to their drug checking page, and then that has a full calendar.
And what about other health authorities? Do they have similar types of programs? Would you find similar information?
Yeah. So if you're listening from Interior Health or Vancouver Island, I would suggest the same thing. You can just Google drug checking, Vancouver Island Health Authority, Google drug checking, Interior Health Authority, and you'll be able to find those services within those areas as well.
This has been a Fraser House Society project, hosted by Daniel Snyder, co-hosted and produced by Karen Jansen, managed by Delanne Young from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. Production of this material has been made in part through a financial contribution of Health Canada. The views expressed herein do not necessarily reflect the views of Health Canada or Fraser House Society. The content of this podcast is conversation between people with living experience and should not be taken as professional advice. Help save lives! Go to tradespodcast.com to find tools and tips to promote the podcast on your site with minimal stressors. Like us on socials, Instagram at offtheclock.toolboxtalk. Send us constructive feedback in any form you'd like. tradespodcast@gmail.com. Help us, help you.